I hope I can help. Necromancy may be legal in Cyrodiil, but few will openly admit to practicing it now that the Mages Guild has banned it. Farewell.
You probably recognise the name, and you probably recognise the face of Bethesda and creative director Todd Howard, one of the most recognisable faces in all of gaming. Bethesda is a game industry giant that has seen critical and commercial success over the years, most notably with their release of Skyrim in 2011. Bethesda in recent years have hit a bit of a rough patch. It has come to a head with the release of Starfield in 2023. When Starfield was initially released, the reviews actually were not too bad, and was received pretty well. But since then, it has been heavily criticised by fans, and it has resulted in a mixed score on Steam and about 100,000 4-hour video essays on the topic. Most of these can be boiled down to one thing: Bethesda's outdated design, which includes repetitive gameplay and shallow main story, which are both things that Bethesda has been attacked for in the past. Todd Howard stated in an interview that Starfield was a next-generation PC game. Players didn't really seem to see it that way. It wasn't Bethesda's odd technical issues or gameplay that stood out to me as bad. It was Starfield's shallow storytelling and world that failed to keep me interested. Starfield is Bethesda's first new IP in 2 decades, something that seemed exciting on announcement. However, in my opinion, this has finally culminated in the core of Bethesda's issues. RPGs are games about story, being immersed in a world that feels like it existed long before you, with culture and people that is vast, where your decisions can shape the world and you fall in love with the characters. Bethesda's approach has long been one of sandbox, their main story often being outright bad, essentially just a vehicle for the player to see the often great setting, factions and world they created. The big issue that comes with Starfield, in my opinion, is when applying that method to a brand new IP that Bethesda has to create themselves entirely from scratch. The Elder Scrolls and Fallout were pre-existing and great settings when Bethesda started hitting their stride. Their method of sandbox was largely shielded by the fact that there was already great things in the setting that they could design around. Even in Bethesda's previous titles, they often dropped some depth and player agency for practicality, something that really riled up fans of the RPG genre. This wasn't a fault of Bethesda's engine or system. Obsidian with Fallout New Vegas proved that they didn't need to sacrifice anything for a great story and player choice. It was likely simply that Bethesda's way of making games and writing ability was at fault. These poor writing practices end up creating a bland and unengaging sci-fi setting in which Starfield exists in. At best, Starfield's world is good looking. At worst, Starfield is about as cohesive as fairy floss and mincemeat. A lot of people have levied blame at the lead writer and designer Emil Pagliarello. The first thing that will likely come up when searching him is his response to criticism on Twitter. It's hard to tear down a man who in all actuality is probably trying to make a good game, and he does have a writing team that works with him. But Emil is the absolute head. In an interview with Polygon, Emil said about Starfield, "Basically, it was up to me to create the lore. Todd had the game idea and I would create the lore. Every time I would create it, I would pass it through Todd." The problem that could be immediately evident is that neither Emil or Todd have any formal writing experience, or anyone on the Bethesda team for that matter. Whilst in the past this was almost viable due to the pre-existing IP they were working with, and although it created a slight disconnect, they could get away with it. But in terms of world building a brand new world that some real life writers struggle with and dedicate entire classes to is a new challenge entirely. World building is an art of stacking culture to make a world to foster factions, environments, settings, themes, and so on. Each piece influences the next, almost in a circle. In video games, this is almost more important and more than a backdrop, since the player can directly interact and shape this world. It's an art unto itself, and if you pair this with Bethesda's more run-and-gun style of writing, you end up in a tough spot. In the same Polygon article, Emil says this: "It's not to say nothing is documented. Everything is. But it's not like there's a giant design doc where the whole game is outlined. There was a design doc that talks about Freestar Collective, and there's a little design doc that talks about United Colonies. And those get updated by designers as they're doing their work. So a lot of the stuff is outdated if you look, and that's why we use the game itself as a work document." This statement from Emil is very telling of the process which a studio operates, one that is constantly changing and updating to fit in new things, giving this game a strange sense of separation. Everything feels as though they live in pockets. Again, this method might have got by in previous titles with deep lore, but you're simply unable to create a whole new world using this method without it being bland and end up without any depth to engage a player. Bethesda's other titles often did have this feeling of separation. Often quests, stories, and locations would be designed by random developers. In fact, this is how all the writers came up through the ranks. Chad of Fallout 76 podcast did an interview with some of the major writers of Bethesda in the video Writing the Worlds of Bethesda. Each writer discusses some of their first quests. This method of picking random designers to make quests can occasionally produce good things. There are good quests in Bethesda's titles, even in Starfield. The issue is that using this method, you end up with everything feeling apart from one another and disconnected. Again, this could work in previous titles, but in Starfield there is no cushioning. There is no backstory to work from. This style only leads to disconnect in design, but also general directionlessness. No place or character has a deep culture to build off. You also end up with generic material, locations, characters, which you can see all throughout the game due to inexperience in writing. Take another famous sci-fi world, for example, Mass Effect, a critically acclaimed trilogy that is known for a fantastic world, characters, and writing. Characters in this game have culture and you feel that. Locations have character and you feel that. Eric Watts, an art designer at BioWare, had this to say at the time. What is the visual language of their clothing? What's the shape of their face? What's iconic? Is this going to work with our conversation system? Are these characters going to be able to show emotion? Are people going to get attached to them? And these are all things you think of as you go through these phases. The article also discusses a constant back and forth with the dedicated writers and the process. This is a huge difference when compared with Bethesda, who had one man with no writing experience at all design an entire world and worked on it as it went. This way Emil designs games bleeds into all aspects. It is inescapable. You end up with boring designs and factions, which leads to bland environments and settings. Look at the Freestar Collective. They're a faction you can join in the game. Their thing is that they dress and act like cowboys. They don't really have any culture beyond some strange Wild West ripoff in space, so it feels unengaging to actually know about them, or even be a part of them. Take for example a well-known and mostly beloved faction of the Brotherhood of Steel. Their goal is to hoard technology because humans can't be trusted with it, and take it by any means necessary. They have a strange culture that has elders, clerics, and initiates. It's deeply hierarchical. Even from this super brief and surface level description, you start painting a picture in your head, you get a picture that isn't generic but interesting and engaging. Look at Star Wars or Dune or any other major sci-fi setting for that matter. They have this uniqueness, this unique setting that is interesting and engaging that Starfield unfortunately just does not have. Emil has an infamous talk given in 2016 at a small gaming convention in Copenhagen. This talk has been subject of many videos, many of his storytelling methods on display. This was likely around a time that he was building the world of Starfield as well. The talk gives us a good look into Emil's thought process in terms of story writing. This talk has been taken apart a lot on YouTube, Reddit, and other sources. There's a couple of things I want to point out from this video. One is when Emil discusses the idea that during the Brotherhood of Steel questline in Fallout 4, they gave you the ability to kill Elder Maxon and take your place as the head of the Brotherhood of Steel, after finding out Dance is a synth. They went so far as to actually building this into the game before pulling it back.
So Paladin Dance, when you're playing the game, he is an important character in the Brotherhood of Steel. It also turns out that he has a very important secret. And when you uncover this secret, and you go to Elder Maxon, the head of the Brotherhood of Steel, we had this idea on paper, sounded great, that you will, if Elder Maxon, the head of the Brotherhood of Steel, doesn't like Paladin Dance and wants to kill him, you can kill Elder Maxon and you can become the head of the Brotherhood of Steel. And it sounds great, right? Like on paper, of course. You know, I kill the head of the organization, I become the head of the organization. We started playing this in the studio, and so what happens is you kill Elder Maxon, you become the head of this faction, and it felt wrong. Everyone else in the faction, all the other members of the Brotherhood of Steel, felt the same way that Elder Maxon did. They didn't like this guy, they didn't like his secret. And it felt very wrong that you could take over the organization and everybody just accepted magically that it was okay that he had the secret. So we changed it.
The reason I bring this up is to demonstrate how run and gun Bethesda in studio truly is. Even to an outsider that isn't directly in the studio, this doesn't seem reasonable. The Brotherhood wouldn't accept a new leader, especially after the last one was murdered, and especially for a synth and Fallout 4. It shows the thought process within the studio. I can't imagine CD Projekt Red or any studio developing an RPG would even let this get into any sort of follow-through stage. It simply seems absurd and proves some form of one-dimensionality in their storytelling. Emil, towards the end of the presentation, mentions how games are an interactive medium, and that you don't only watch the story, you participate in it, which is absolutely true. Emil brings up the bear scene from The Revenant and the Red Wedding from Game of Thrones. He gives examples of the player's ability to do this in-game. What he fundamentally is missing is the actual story within the scenes he shows. Simply doing the actions doesn't give the story the same amount of weight. These examples might appear nebulous at first, but when you actually play and look at the quests in Starfield, you can see that they are designed so one-dimensionally. It's as if Emil conflates situations with stories, and that is something you see quite often in Bethesda quests. I've been looking at Starfield in broad strokes and outlining the process of how I think we have gotten here. Looking at any particular faction in Starfield, I think you will see in action how this process and approach hurt Starfield. Take a look at the Crimson Fleet, a questline that a lot of people said they actually enjoyed. But if you boil it down to its essentials, what you get is a story about space pirates hunting for treasure. The situational stuff is why this questline is interesting, but not the story itself. Playing both sides and seeing the reacting factions. If you take this and zoom out and apply it to most quests regarding Bethesda, you'll find that most of Bethesda is like this. They do situations, not stories. This isn't bad every once in a while, but look at Bethesda as a whole. This is what they've been doing for years. That is the inexperience of the writing staff in action. They struggle to create interesting stories around the interesting situations. The characters within Constellation aren't characters, they are quirks and shallow traits that make a character exactly the way you expect them to be. Unfortunately, Starfield is unfixable. No matter the technical updates or the adding in of land vehicles, but Starfield's core isn't there. No matter how much you design or change, if something is faulty at its base, it will never truly stand. Due to Emil and Bethesda's process, Starfield was doomed from the start, because if you don't have a base with depth to work with, how is everyone else supposed to create depth in environments, characters, weapons, and the overall setting? Bethesda is a studio that, despite their shortcomings, has remained relevant in the industry and continued to be commercially successful. Likely the new Elder Scrolls game will be that as well. That's their trump card. However, what Bethesda is spending for this success right now is goodwill from the players.